I'm Nima Rajan. A convoy of truckers protesting mandatory vaccinations is expected to be in the national capital this weekend. The drivers are planning to hold a rally in Ottawa on Saturday, and police there are working with the RCMP and intelligence services to prepare. Ottawa Police Chief Peter Slowly says the protest leaders have been cooperative and they have shared their plans. But there are concerns that the far-right extremist groups that have attached themselves to the convoy could spark violence. Security forces on Parliament Hill are preparing for up to 10,000 protesters, while Ottawa police warn residents to avoid traveling in the city. Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland says Canada's actions in support of Ukraine against Russian aggression are not simply a show of political support for the large Ukrainian diaspora that she is part of. Ms. Freeland says this is a struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. She attended the news conference yesterday where Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced Canada is expanding its military training mission to Ukraine, but not sending weapons for now. Meanwhile, the NDP supports the Trudeau government's decision to extend and expand Operation Unifor to train Ukrainian soldiers. But the Conservatives are accusing the Prime Minister of letting Ukraine down with his decision not to ship any lethal defensive weapons overseas. Mr. Trudeau is stressing that the training mission is not a combat mission, but one that is intended to help Ukraine defend itself against Russian aggression. The Canada Revenue Agency is sending out a new round of letters to those who got emergency aid from Ottawa. This to help them through pandemic-related lockdowns. It is the second time the agency is mailing Canada Emergency Response Benefit receipts. This is to verify the eligibility of the millions of Canadians who receive the $500 a week benefit. Thousands of letters will target those whose tax filings suggest that they may have earned more than the $1,000 a month that the Liberals allowed outside of CERB checks. Officials in Ottawa say they have confirmed the identities of 4 Indian nationals whose bodies were found frozen in Manitoba near the Canada-US border last week. The High Commission of India released a notice saying the 4 who died were a 39-year-old man, a 37-year-old woman, an 11-year-old girl, and a 3-year-old boy. Investigators believe the family of 4 was attempting to cross over the border by foot on January 19th during severe winter weather and died from exposure. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he is isolating at home. This after learning that he was exposed to someone who had tested positive for COVID-19. The Prime Minister says in a tweet that he learned about the exposure just last night. He says the result of a rapid antigen test he took was negative, but he is following local public health rules and isolating for 5 days. Quebec, Ontario, and Prince Edward Island plan to soften some of their COVID-19 restrictions next week, with in-person dining to resume with limits in all 3 provinces. Ontario will also allow its gyms and movie theaters to open with capacity limits. Ontario's opposition NDP is calling on Premier Doug Ford's Progressive Conservative government to resume non-urgent surgeries and take action to clear the COVID-induced backlog in medical procedures. BC's Court of Appeal has overturned a lower court ruling and extended an injunction against old-growth logging protests on part of Vancouver Island until September. Supreme Court Justice Douglas Thompson previously refused to extend the injunction. He said police enforcement at the Fairy Creek site led to serious infringements of civil liberties. But a panel of 3 judges granted the appeal by forestry company Teal Cedar Products. The panel says Justice Thompson erred in finding the police actions could tarnish the reputations of the court and gave too little weight to the public interest in upholding the rule of law. Uber is partnering with the United Food and Commercial Workers Canada Union to provide its drivers and couriers with representation in the event of a dispute. The deal does not mean the workers are unionizing. Workers won't be charged for the representation services, and both the company and the union say they will work to encourage provinces to mandate policies providing gig workers with new benefits and other rights. Streaming giant Spotify says it will grant veteran Canadian rocker Neil Young's request to remove his music from its streaming platform. Mr. Young made the demand this week to protest what he called the company's decision to allow COVID misinformation to spread on its service by other talent. Spotify airs Joe Rogan's popular podcast, where last month he interviewed a doctor who's been banned from Twitter for spreading misinformation. All right, stay with us. We'll be right back after the break with a look at interest rates and what it means for viewers. We'll have an interview with Brendan Caldwell, director of Caldwell Securities Limited, up next. So stay with us. We'll be right back on Forum Daily News. The Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem says interest rates will need to increase to control inflation. The central bank is keeping its key interest rate target on hold at 0.25%, but is warning that Canadians should expect a rising path for interest rates. Mr. Macklem says the rapid spread of the Omicron variant of COVID-19 has been an economic wildcard, which is why the bank held off on hiking rates. CIBC Chief Economist Avery Schenfeld expects the Bank of Canada to raise rates in March if the country gets better news about Omicron. Well, joining us now to give us an idea of how these interest rates might impact Canadians in the near future is Brendan Caldwell, Director of Caldwell Securities Limited. Brendan, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Always great to be here, Nima. Thank you.
Always great having you, Brendan. Now, both the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve are expecting to begin these rate hikes in March and accelerate this year. But could this be a good thing? Would this maybe help slow the pace of price pressures that we've been seeing throughout 2021?
Well, weirdly, Nima, the actually raising interest rates, which is supposed to slow the economy down by making it more difficult to access capital. I mean, it's hard enough to access fruits and vegetables now. Because of supply chain issues. So now they make it harder to access capital. As you say that out loud, does it sound like something that actually will help inflation, at least in the short term, slow down, or will it actually raise the price of things? So yes, in theory, raising short-term interest rates, which is the part of the yield curve, the very short-term rates that the Bank of Canada and the U.S. Federal Reserve control, raising them is supposed to slow down the economy and dampen out inflation. But at least in the short term, it may well have the opposite effect.
Well, bringing this back to our Canadian viewers, Brendan, how heavy of an impact will these interest rate hikes be for everyday people with mortgages?
Well, it could be significant. You've already seen a bit of an uptick in mortgage rates. And Canada and the U.S. are different when it comes to mortgages. But I think you'll seeing interest rates probably will go up. But what you're actually seeing right now is, you notice the Bank of Canada is talking about raising rates, but hasn't actually done it yet. So it's trying to talk a good game, use moral suasion, if you will, to get people to believe interest rates are going higher and thereby slow things down without actually having to do anything. But notwithstanding, I do think mortgage rates have the potential to go higher over the next year or two.
All right, Brendan. Well, in this ever-changing environment, interest rates expected to be risen in March. What kind of mortgage should Canadians get, fixed rate or floating?
It really depends on their position. My suggestion to most of my clients who have talked to about this in the last while is a fixed rate mortgage. That is not going to be the lowest rate that you can possibly get from your bank or financial institution today. You will see rates that are advertised lower, but those tend to be floating rate mortgages. So as interest rates go up, your the cost of your mortgage, or at least the amount of interest that will be paid on your mortgage, goes up and up with it. So my best guess for most people right now would be a fixed rate mortgage.
All right, Brendan. Well, in this world of mortgages, we hear a lot about teaser rates, and they do look tempting, but how would they affect us in the long run?
Well, that's what you're seeing is you'll see a very low rate posted, but it will be a floating rate, so that it may be that after 3 months or 6 months, the rate goes up automatically, or it may be that as interest rates as a whole, as the Bank of Canada raises interest rates and the bank raises their prime rate, you may see those rates begin to creep up or even go up quite dramatically in the next while. So the lowest rate posted, these, what word to use, teaser rates, could actually be well, trap might be a strong word, but they're meant as a teaser. They're meant to get you in. But I think people should look at a fixed rate mortgage over as long a period of time as is feasible, 3 years, 5 years, something along those lines.
All right, Brendan, just about a minute left here, but there are so many reports that the younger generation wants to get into the housing market. But should we keep buying a home right now, or should we consider buying a home right now, or keep renting?
Well, I think first and foremost it's a lifestyle choice to where you want to live, how you want to live. My feeling is that these interest rates will at least give us a bit of a pause. If interest rates go higher, it will at the very least give a pause in real estate prices. So they've been going up seemingly inexorably for years now, but that's not going to last forever. Whether we have a full-on correction or a bear market in housing, or whether it's just a pause, I do think the younger generation is going to have a bit of a window to be able to get in, because real estate goes in very long cycles.
All right, Brendan Caldwell, always great having you on Forum Daily. Thank you again for your time today.
Thank you, Nima.
The president of the Ambulance Paramedics of BC says an incredible number of the group's members are off the job or in treatment. This because of psychological injuries due to the pandemic and the opioid crisis. But the situation is not unique to BC. Paramedics across Canada are beginning to feel the mental and physical strain of current working conditions. A survey last fall in Ontario found 84% of paramedics reported an increased workload was affecting their mental and physical health. The heads of groups representing Canadian paramedics are calling for improved mental health services. This comes as staff shortages and unprecedented call volumes take a toll on workers. Well, with us to discuss the struggles currently being faced by Canada's paramedics is Mr. Dave Dinas, president of the Paramedic Association of Canada. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
So can you briefly explain the current difficulties being faced by paramedics across the country, sir?
Yeah, well, first I'd like to start by thanking all the paramedics that are still showing up every day to provide the essential service to Canadians from coast to coast to coast. A very resilient group, and we'll continue to do that through this pandemic. But as you have mentioned, obviously, we are feeling the stress, just like a lot of other people, with the increased call volume, the increased pressures around responding to COVID, and some of the associated fallout from that, for sure.
All right, sir. Well, what kinds of mental health services are currently available for paramedics in Canada?
Yeah, it really depends on the jurisdiction that you're in. Obviously, health is a provincial issue, and then depending on the jurisdiction in Canada, it depends on how paramedic services are delivered. So, for example, several provinces are provincially run services that have access to government and robust mental health and wellness programs, where there are other parts in Canada that have very small, either private operators or county or municipal-based services that may not have the same level. So it varies greatly from coast to coast to coast.
All right, Mr. Dinas. Well, we mentioned that advocates are calling for improved mental health services across the country. What would that look like?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, the issues are very complex. Certainly in some jurisdictions, the addition of presumptive legislation in some jurisdictions would allow paramedics access to more supports. Obviously, funding for mental health and wellness and psychological safety clinicians and rapid access to them. Even in jurisdictions that have some of those supports, the wait times are growing and growing, and that keeps paramedics obviously off the job. We want them to be healthy, of course, to do the vital work they do. And so on the mental health and wellness piece, those are certainly some of the things that can help, along with the workload side of things as well. And you know, we need more paramedics in the system for sure, as well as there's some jurisdictions that can do things to help mitigate the amount of calls that paramedics go to and where we take patients.
And considering the current service disruptions that we're seeing due to this mental health strain, what's at risk here in terms of paramedic services across the country if changes aren't made?
Yeah, absolutely. When we start decreasing the amount of paramedics that are in the system and able to work, obviously that has an impact on the amount of ambulance and paramedic crews that are available. And once we start talking about that, obviously response times will suffer and patients won't get a timely response to paramedics when they need them.
Just over a minute left here, sir, but just to give our viewers some perspective, how has the pandemic and opioid crisis impacted the work lives of paramedics?
Sure, it's made a tremendous impact. I was just on a national call the other day with the Public Health Agency of Canada. We know that the pandemic has increased the opioid toxicity death by 89% since the same period of time pre-pandemic. So the workload, just not only in pandemic COVID calls, but the opioid crisis, as well as some of the climate change emergencies we've seen in the country. And then, of course, just the day-to-day work. Responding to COVID patients requires paramedics and other public safety professionals to wear a different level of personal protection equipment that I'm sure you've seen in the news. That's very time-consuming and physically and emotionally draining on paramedics.
All right, sir, just a quick 30 seconds left here, but what do we know so far about how provinces and governments are trying to tackle this issue?
I think overall, there's been a good recognition that some things need to be put in place. Recognition, obviously, along with any issue, is the first step. So we've had some good traction around the country with providers recognizing that we need to provide some supports and do some better things to allow paramedics to respond to those in need.
We'll definitely have to keep our eyes out on these developments. Mr. Dinas, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, stay with us. We'll be right back after the break with news from around the world, as the Kremlin says there is little ground for optimism after the U.S. rejected its demands over Ukraine. We'll have that story and more news from around the world coming up next. A Kremlin spokesman says dialogue is still possible, but there is little ground for optimism. This comes after the U.S. rejected Moscow's main demands to resolve the crisis over Ukraine. As expected, the U.S. and its NATO allies firmly rejected Moscow's demand that Ukraine be permanently banned from joining NATO and that allied deployments of troops and military equipment in Eastern Europe are non-negotiable. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says the U.S. response contained some elements that could lead to the start of a serious talk on secondary issues. Nearly 1,500 people died of malnutrition in just part of Ethiopia's blockaded Tigray region over a 4-month period last year. This, according to a report by the region's health bureau. It cites more than 5,000 blockade-related deaths, all from hunger and disease. This is the largest official death toll yet associated with the country's war. The head of Tigray's health bureau tells the Associated Press that the assessment reflects deaths between July and October and covers just 40% of the region. He fears that the death toll in still inaccessible areas will show the real extent of the crisis. While the European Union says it has launched action against China at World Trade's governing body for discriminatory practices against Lithuania. The bloc says Beijing's spat with the Baltic country is hitting other EU exports. Lithuania broke with diplomatic custom by agreeing that the Taiwanese office in Vilnius would bear the name Taiwan instead of Chinese Taipei, a term used by other countries to avoid offending Beijing. Tit-for-tat embassy closures ensued. Tensions have mounted, and the EU turned to the World Trade Organization. All right, well, meanwhile, China is demanding the U.S. end what it calls interference in the Beijing Winter Olympics, which begin on February 4th. The Foreign Ministry says Minister Wang Yi made the demand in a phone call with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. The U.S., Canada, and some other main allies say they won't send dignitaries to the Games to protest China's human rights record and its detention of 1 million Uyghur Muslims in the northwestern region of Xinjiang. U.S.-backed Kurdish-led forces say dozens of armed Islamic State militants remained holed up in the last occupied section of a Syrian prison. The two sides clashed a day after the Syrian Democratic Forces announced that they had regained control. The SDF says fighting on Thursday between the armed extremists and SDF troops left at least 2 militants dead in the city of Hasaka. The SDF claimed Wednesday that it had regained full control of the prison a week after scores of militants overran the facility. The U.S. economy grew at the fastest pace since 1984 last year. Gross domestic product, the total output of goods and services, expanded 5.7% and ended the year by growing at a solid 6.9% pace in the fourth quarter. The U.S. economy is expected to keep expanding this year, but at a slower pace due to inflation and the impact of the COVID-19 Omicron variant. The UN Secretary General is urging the world's nations to greatly boost humanitarian aid for millions of Afghans now living in, quote, a frozen hell. He is also calling for the release of nearly $9 billion in frozen assets to pull Afghanistan's economy back from the brink of collapse. The international community froze Afghanistan's assets abroad, unwilling to work with the Taliban given the brutality during their 1996 to 2001 rule, their violent seizure of power last year, and their refusal to educate girls and allow women to work. Well, this is Holocaust Remembrance Day, marking the date 77 years ago that the Allies liberated the Auschwitz concentration camp. At in-person and online events, both survivors and politicians warned about the resurgence of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. 87-year-old survivor Inga Auerbacher told the German parliament that, quote, unfortunately, this cancer has reawakened and hatred of Jews is commonplace again in many countries in the world, including Germany. To tackle Holocaust denial, UNESCO and the World Jewish Congress launched a partnership today with TikTok. It will channel users to verified information when searching for terms related to the Holocaust. January 26th was the 12th annual Bell Let's Talk Day. It's a day where people in Canada and around the world join together to make the world a better place for those living with mental health challenges. Bell says over 164 million interactions were recorded on Wednesday. In turn, it will be donating over $8.2 million to Canadian mental health initiatives. All right, that'll do it for your look at national and international news. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily.